Philosopher John Stuart Mill believed that the human mind was open to scientific investigation, even if the science is in some ways inexact. Mill proposed a mental chemistry, in which elementary thoughts could combine into ideas of greater complexity. Gustav Fechner began conducting psychophysics research in Leipzig in the 1830s. He articulated the principle that human perception of a stimulus varies logarithmically according to its intensity. U261, U200. The principle became known as the Weber-Fechner law. Fechner's 1860 Elements of Psychophysics challenged Kant's negative view with regard to conducting quantitative research on the mind. Fechner's achievement was to show that mental processes could not only be given numerical magnitudes, but also that these could be measured by experimental methods. In Heidelberg, Hermann von Helmholtz conducted parallel research on sensory perception, and trained physiologist Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt, in turn, came to Leipzig University, where he established the psychological laboratory that brought experimental psychology to the world. Wundt focused on breaking down mental processes into the most basic components, motivated in part by an analogy to recent advances in chemistry, and its successful investigation of the elements and structure of materials. Paul Flessig and Emil Kraepelin soon created another influential laboratory at Leipzig, a psychology-related lab that focused more on experimental psychiatry. The German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, a researcher at the University of Berlin, was another 19th-century contributor to the field. He pioneered the experimental study of memory and developed quantitative models of learning and forgetting. In the early 20th century, Wolfgang Kohler, Max Wertheimer, and Kurt Koffka co-founded the School of Gestalt Psychology, not to be confused with the Gestalt therapy of Fritz Perls. The approach of Gestalt psychology is based upon the idea that individuals experience things as unified wholes, rather than reducing thoughts and behavior into smaller component elements. As in structuralism, the Gestaltists maintained that whole of experience is important, and differs from the sum of its parts. Psychologists in Germany, Denmark, Austria, England, and the United States soon followed Wundt in setting up laboratories. G. Stanley Hall, an American who studied with Wundt, founded a psychology lab that became internationally influential. The lab was located at Johns Hopkins University. Hall, in turn, trained Yujiro Motora, who brought experimental psychology, emphasizing psychophysics, to the Imperial University of Tokyo. Wundt's assistant, Hugo Munsterberg, taught psychology at Harvard to students such as Narendra Nath Sen-Gupta, who, in 1905, founded a psychology department and laboratory at the University of Calcutta. Wundt's students Walter Dill Scott, Leitner Whitmer, and James McKean Cattell worked on developing tests of mental ability. Cattell, who also studied with eugenicist Francis Galton, went on to found the Psychological Corporation. Whitmer focused on the mental testing of children. Scott, on employee selection. U260, U200A. Another student of Wundt, the Englishman Edward Titchener, created the psychology program at Cornell University and advanced structuralist psychology. The idea behind structuralism was to analyze and classify different aspects of the mind, primarily through the method of introspection. William James, John Dewey, and Harvey Carr advanced the idea of functionalism, an expansive approach to psychology that underlined the Darwinian idea of a behavior's usefulness to the individual. In 1890, James wrote an influential book, The Principles of Psychology, which expanded on the structuralism he memorably described, stream of consciousness. James' ideas interested many American students in the emerging discipline. U200 a 178-82, U200 a Dewey integrated psychology with societal concerns, most notably by promoting progressive education, inculcating moral values in children, and assimilating immigrants. U200 a 196-200, U200 a different strain of experimentalism, with a greater connection to physiology, emerged in South America, under the leadership of Horacio G. Pinheiro at the University of Buenos Aires. In Russia, too, researchers placed greater emphasis on the biological basis for psychology, beginning with Ivan Sechenov, s. 1873 essay, Who is to Develop Psychology and How? Sechenov advanced the idea of brain reflexes and aggressively promoted a deterministic view of human behavior. The Russian-Soviet physiologist Ivan Pavlov discovered in dogs a learning process that was later termed classical conditioning, and applied the process to human beings.